Welcome back to Nocturnal Nightmares TV, where the rain weaves a sinister thread through tonight's chilling tales. Before we plunge into the shadows, I want to express my deepest gratitude for the amazing support on our last video. Your encouragement keeps these haunting stories alive. Now, prepare yourself for another spine-tingling journey into terror as we unravel your rain-drenched nightmares. Don't forget to show some love by hitting that like button, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Oh, and let me know, where are you watching from? Now, let's step into the storm and embrace the darkness. The draining storm. The rain doesn't wet the ground, but instead drains energy and life from those it touches. Chapter 1. The First Raindrops. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, the town of Hollow Creek basked in a warm, sunny afternoon, and the next, dark clouds rolled in with unnatural speed. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and the first drops of rain began to fall. But something was wrong. The raindrops didn't splash or soak into the earth. Instead, they shimmered and vanished, leaving the ground dry. "What kind of rain doesn't make puddles?" murmured Eliza, a young woman who had just stepped out of the bakery. She extended her hand, catching a drop on her skin. A chill shot through her body, and she gasped, her energy draining as if she'd been running for hours. Her vision blurred, and she staggered back inside. Others weren't so lucky. Across the town, people collapsed where they stood, their strength sapped by the rain. The storm grew heavier, the dark clouds swirling ominously as more drops fell, glinting like liquid silver. Panic set in, but no one could explain the phenomenon. Chapter 2. The First Losses. By the next morning, Hollow Creek was a ghost town. Streets once bustling with life were eerily silent, and the few who ventured outside did so cautiously, draped in tarps and makeshift coverings to avoid the rain. Eliza watched from her window, her skin pale and her energy still sapped from her brief exposure. Her neighbor, old Mr. Grayson, had been one of the first to succumb. Eliza saw him lying in his garden, his once vibrant face hollow and gaunt. "It's not natural," she whispered to herself. "This rain, it's alive." Word spread quickly. Those who touched the rain fell ill, and those exposed for too long disappeared. The town's mayor issued a curfew, urging everyone to stay indoors, but supplies were dwindling. People began to wonder if the storm would ever end. Chapter 3. The Rain's Whisper. Eliza's dreams were haunted by the storm. She saw herself standing in the middle of an endless rain, the drops whispering secrets she couldn't understand. Each morning, she woke more drained than the last, even though she hadn't left her house. She wasn't the only one. Others reported hearing the whispers, soft and insistent, like a lullaby just out of reach. Some said the whispers called their names, urging them to step outside. Eliza's best friend, Caroline, confided in her over a crackly phone line. "It's like the rain is alive," she said. "It's waiting for something." That night, Caroline's house lights flickered out, and by morning, she was gone. Chapter 4. The Forgotten Journal. Desperate for answers, Eliza ventured into her late grandfather's study. He had been a historian and often spoke of Hollow Creek's strange past. Among the dusty tomes and faded photographs, she found an old, leather-bound journal. Its brittle pages contained detailed accounts of a similar storm from over a century ago. "The Black Veil Storm," the journal read. "Rain that takes more than it gives, feeding on life itself." The entries described how the storm had consumed the town for weeks, leaving only a handful of survivors. One passage caught her eye: "To end the storm, one must face its heart. But beware, for the heart of the storm is as alive as the rain it commands." Chapter 5. The First Attempt. With no other options, Eliza decided to follow the journal's cryptic advice. She prepared for her journey with care, layering herself in waterproof gear and clutching the journal tightly. As night fell, she stepped outside, the draining rain bouncing off her makeshift armor. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and the air felt charged with malice. Eliza pushed through the empty streets, her strength waning despite her precautions. The journal had mentioned an anchor, a place where the storm's power was concentrated. She headed toward the old clock tower, the tallest structure in town. But as she neared the tower, the rain seemed to intensify, each drop striking her like a blow. Shadows moved in the periphery of her vision, and she felt an overwhelming urge to stop. "You can't win," the whispers hissed. "You belong to us now." Chapter 6: The Heart of the Storm. Inside the clock tower, Eliza found a spiral staircase leading to the belfry. The higher she climbed, the heavier the air became, until every breath felt like a battle. At the top, she discovered a glowing orb suspended in midair, pulsing with dark energy. This was the heart of the storm. The journal had warned of a ritual to weaken the storm, but it required great sacrifice. Eliza read the incantation aloud, her voice trembling as the storm's whispers turned to screams. The orb pulsed faster, and the rain outside seemed to grow frantic, hammering against the tower like a living thing. Chapter 7: The Sacrifice. The ritual demanded a life force to counteract the storm's hunger. Eliza realized with dawning horror that it wanted hers. She hesitated, her mind racing through alternatives, but the storm wouldn't wait. The orb began to crack, its glow intensifying as if ready to burst. "If I don't do this, the town is doomed," she whispered. Summoning every ounce of courage, she placed her hand on the orb. Pain shot through her body as the storm's energy coursed into her, draining her life force. But she held on, reciting the incantation until her voice gave out. With a final, blinding flash, the orb shattered, and the storm stopped. The rain ceased, and the whispers faded into silence. Chapter 8: The Aftermath. Eliza woke in the belfry, weak but alive. The town was eerily quiet, the air fresh and free of the storm's oppressive weight. As she stumbled down the staircase, she saw neighbors emerging cautiously from their homes, their faces etched with disbelief and relief. The ground was littered with blackened, lifeless raindrops that crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. The storm's curse had ended, but its scars would linger in the memories of Hollow Creek's people. Chapter 9: The Survivor. Weeks passed, and life in Hollow Creek slowly returned to normal. Eliza became a local hero, though she shunned the attention. She spent her days quietly, tending to her garden and reflecting on the storm. But at night, she dreamed of the orb and the whispers, a reminder of what she had faced. One evening, she noticed a faint drizzle outside. Panic surged through her until she stepped out and felt the cool, harmless touch of ordinary rain. She smiled, tears mixing with the raindrops, grateful for the storm's end. Chapter 10: The Warning. Years later, Eliza received a letter from a distant town, describing a storm with rain that didn't wet the ground. Her hands trembled as she read the familiar words. The Black Veil storm had returned, and this time, it wasn't coming for Hollow Creek. Eliza packed her things, ready to face the storm once more. The storm's eyes. Giant, glowing eyes appear in the clouds during storms, and those who look directly at them disappear. Chapter 1: The First Sightings. The storm rolled in with an eerie quietness. Dark clouds gathered over the small town of Harrington, churning in slow, deliberate patterns. At first, the storm seemed ordinary: heavy rain, gusting winds, the occasional flicker of lightning. But as dusk settled, the whispers began. "Did you see them?" a man muttered at the diner counter, his coffee trembling in his hands. The eyes. Ellie Kane, a college student home for the summer, overheard the conversation. She had been watching the storm from her bedroom window and thought it strange how the lightning illuminated the clouds for longer than usual, casting strange shadows. But eyes. That sounded ridiculous. She dismissed it as small-town superstition, yet the unease in the man's voice lingered with her. Later that night, Ellie's brother Sam burst into her room. "You've got to see this," he said, dragging her to the window. In the distance, above the town square, the clouds glowed faintly, as if illuminated from within. Then she saw them, two massive, glowing orbs, like eyes, staring down at the earth. Her breath caught in her throat. They blinked. Chapter 2: The Disappearances. By morning, 3 people were missing. The mayor's office issued a statement blaming the storm for the disappearances, claiming they had likely been swept away by flash floods. But those who had seen the eyes knew better. Ellie scrolled through her phone, reading frantic posts from neighbors. "Don't look at them," one post warned. "If you do, they take you." Others claimed to hear whispers when the eyes appeared, faint voices calling their names. Sam had become obsessed, drawing pictures of the glowing eyes on every scrap of paper he could find. "They're watching us," he whispered. They know who looks. That's how they choose. Ellie tried to snap him out of it. It's just a storm, Sam. Stop scaring yourself. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Chapter 3. The Warnings. At the hardware store, an elderly woman cornered Ellie. Stay inside when they come, she said, gripping Ellie's arm with surprising strength. And whatever you do, don't look at them. Even a glance is enough. Ellie nodded politely, but the woman's wild eyes unnerved her. That evening, the storm returned. The power flickered, plunging the house into darkness. Ellie lit candles and tried to focus on her book, but Sam was glued to the window, staring into the distance. They're back, he whispered. Against her better judgment, Ellie joined him. The glowing eyes were there, larger and brighter than before. The air felt heavy, pressing down on her chest. She grabbed Sam's arm. Come on, we're staying away from the windows, she said, pulling him back. Chapter 4. The Taken. The next morning, Sam was gone. His bed was neatly made, his shoes by the door. Ellie's parents assumed he had gone to a friend's house, but Ellie knew better. She found his notebook on the floor, open to a hastily scrawled message. They called my name. I have to go. Desperate, Ellie searched the town for answers. She spoke to anyone who would listen, but most people avoided her gaze, too afraid to talk about the storm. One man, a reclusive historian named Arthur Grayson, finally relented. The eyes have been here before, he explained. Generations ago, when the town was first founded. My grandmother used to say they're watchers from another realm, looking for something, or someone. Ellie pressed him for more, but he shook his head. No one who's been taken ever comes back. You can't fight them. Your only hope is to hide. Chapter 5. The Whispering Wind. The storms grew more frequent, and with each one, more people disappeared. Ellie barricaded herself in her room, but the whispers seeped through the walls. They called her name, soft and insistent, like a lullaby. She covered her ears, but the sound only grew louder. One night, she woke to find her window open. Rain blew in, soaking the floor, and the glowing eyes hovered just beyond the glass. She froze, unable to look away as the whispers filled her mind. Ellie, they cooed. Come with us. With a surge of willpower, she slammed the window shut and pulled the curtains closed. The whispers stopped, but the terror remained. Chapter 6. The Eye of the Storm. Determined to find Sam, Ellie confronted the storm head-on. She ventured into the town square during the next downpour, the glowing eyes watching her every move. The whispers grew louder, guiding her toward the center of the square. There, she found a strange circle etched into the cobblestones, glowing faintly with the same light as the eyes. At its center lay an old, weathered book. She picked it up, its pages damp but intact, and began to read. The book described a ritual to banish the eyes, a series of incantations and symbols that needed to be drawn in specific locations around the town. But the final page warned, the eyes will not go quietly. They will test your resolve. Chapter 7. The Test. Ellie spent the next day preparing for the ritual, gathering chalk, candles, and herbs mentioned in the book. As night fell, she ventured out, the storm raging above her. The glowing eyes followed her every step, their whispers now a deafening roar. At each location, she drew the symbols and lit the candles, reciting the incantations with shaking hands. The storm grew fiercer, the wind threatening to snuff out the flames. Shadows moved in the periphery of her vision, but she refused to look. By the time she reached the final location, the church bell tower, her strength was nearly gone. She climbed the steps, the book clutched to her chest, and completed the last symbol. Chapter 8. The Banishment. The storm reached its peak as Ellie recited the final incantation. The glowing eyes converged above the bell tower, their light blinding. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of anger and despair. With a final shout, Ellie hurled the book into the air. It burst into flames, and the storm abruptly ceased. The eyes blinked once, twice, and then vanished, leaving the sky clear and star-filled. Ellie collapsed, the silence almost as overwhelming as the storm had been. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. In the days that followed, the town began to heal. The missing were mourned, but those who remained were grateful to be alive. Ellie became a local legend, the girl who had faced the storm and won. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes were still watching, waiting for another chance. Chapter 10: The Return. Years later, on a quiet summer evening, Ellie sat on her porch, sipping tea. The sky was clear, the stars bright. But in the distance, a faint rumble of thunder echoed. She stared at the horizon, her heart sinking as dark clouds began to gather. And then she saw them, two glowing eyes, watching from the heavens. The Blackwater Deluge. Black rain floods the town, and anyone who touches it is turned into a shadowy, waterlogged creature. Chapter 1: The First Drops. The rain began as an odd drizzle, dark and murky, like ink diluted with water. At first, the townspeople thought it was pollution from the factories upstream. But as the rain thickened, concern turned to alarm. By evening, the streets of Dreadmore were slick with puddles of black water, and a foul, briny stench filled the air. Jody Markham, a journalist for the local paper, stared out her office window. The rain didn't glisten under the streetlights. Instead, it seemed to absorb the light, making the world outside unnaturally dim. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her friend Caleb. "Don't touch the rain. Something's wrong." She laughed it off as paranoia, but when she spotted a soaked figure stumbling across the street, her breath caught. The person's movements were jerky and unnatural, as if they were a puppet on strings. When they turned toward her window, Jody froze. Their eyes were pools of darkness, and water dripped incessantly from their hollow, sagging features. Chapter 2: The Warnings. By the next morning, panic gripped the town. The black rain showed no signs of stopping. Those who ventured out into it disappeared, leaving their homes eerily silent. Rumors spread like wildfire. The rain wasn't natural, it was cursed. At the diner, Jody listened to the frantic chatter. Caleb was there, his face pale as he recounted what he'd seen. "My neighbor stepped outside for just a second. When she came back, she wasn't herself. She's gone now. Just disappeared into the rain." Jody tried to rationalize it. "Maybe she's hiding. People are scared, Caleb." He shook his head. "No, Jody. She's one of them now. The things. Whatever this rain does, it changes people." A sudden clap of thunder silenced the room. Everyone turned to the windows. The rain was falling harder now, the drops thick and viscous, leaving trails of darkness wherever they landed. Jody felt a chill. She needed answers, and fast. Chapter 3: The Flood. The town's drainage system couldn't keep up with the deluge. Black water began pooling in the streets, rising inch by inch. Jody's basement flooded overnight, the water creeping up the stairs like a living thing. She stuffed towels under the door, but the liquid seeped through, staining everything it touched. Desperate for information, she scoured old town records and folklore. She found a peculiar story about the Blackwater Curse, a legend passed down from the area's earliest settlers. According to the tale, a ship carrying forbidden cargo had sunk off the coast centuries ago. The cargo, black urns filled with ancient, cursed water, had tainted the sea, and now the rain. The journal she found ended ominously: "When the rain turns black, the sea will claim the land, and all who touch it will belong to the depths." Chapter 4: The First Transformation. Jody's neighbor, Mr. Turner, had been one of the first to ignore the warnings. She watched helplessly from her window as he trudged through the rain to fetch his dog. By the time he returned, he was different. His movements were sluggish, his skin pale and bloated, and his eyes, once bright and friendly, were now obsidian voids. "Mr. Turner," she called cautiously. He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, water dripping from his jaw as he stared at her. Then, with an unnatural swiftness, he turned and stumbled back into the rain, disappearing into the growing flood. Chapter 5: The Gathering Shadows. The creatures born from the rain began to multiply. They moved in groups, their watery forms blending with the storm. Jody realized they were drawn to movement, to sound. She stayed as quiet as possible, keeping her lights off and her doors locked. Caleb called her that night, his voice shaking. "They're outside my house. Just standing there. I think they know I'm here." "Stay inside," she urged. "Don't make a sound." There was a crash on the other end of the line. Caleb screamed, and the call went dead. Jodi's heart pounded as she stared at her phone. She couldn't stay in her house forever. She had to find a way to stop this. Chapter 6: The Source. Jodi's research led her to the coast, to the site where the cursed ship had sunk. She discovered that the wreck had recently been disturbed, a treasure-hunting expedition gone wrong. The black urns had been opened, releasing their ancient curse. She contacted Dr. Elias Grayson, an expert on maritime folklore. He was skeptical at first, but when she showed him photos of the rain and the creatures, his demeanor changed. If the urns were disturbed, the curse is active, he said grimly. The only way to stop it is to return the water to the sea and seal the urns. How do we do that? Jodi asked. He hesitated. You'll need to enter the storm. Chapter 7: Into the Storm. Armed with Grayson's instructions, Jodi ventured into the heart of the flood. The black rain was relentless, soaking her to the bone. She carried the largest urn she could find, its surface etched with strange, glowing symbols. The creatures sensed her. They emerged from the water, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Jodi ran, her lungs burning as she splashed through the flooded streets. The sea loomed ahead, its waves crashing violently against the shore. Chapter 8: The Ritual. At the water's edge, Jodi recited the incantation Grayson had provided. The urn grew warm in her hands, and the rain seemed to hesitate, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. The creatures surrounded her, their forms twisting and writhing. She hurled the urn into the sea, shouting the final words of the incantation. A blinding light erupted from the water, and a deafening roar filled the air. The creatures let out unearthly screams as they dissolved into mist, carried away by the wind. Chapter 9: The Calm. When Jodi awoke, the storm was gone. The streets were dry, and the air was clear. The town was eerily quiet, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. The black rain had left its mark, stains on buildings, cracks in the pavement, but the curse seemed to be lifted. Caleb's house was empty, as were many others. The town had lost so much, but it had survived. Jodi knew the cost of the victory, and it weighed heavily on her. Chapter 10: The Warning. Months later, Jodi returned to the coast. She stood on the cliffs, staring out at the horizon. The sea was calm, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting. In her dreams, she still heard the rain, felt its cold touch. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, she thought she could hear whispers carried from the waves. We are not finished. The rain forest. A mysterious rain creates a lush forest overnight, but the plants have a hunger for human flesh. Chapter 1: The Unnatural Downpour. The rain began as a drizzle, but within minutes it turned into a torrential storm. The residents of Willow's Hollow gathered at their windows, puzzled by the eerie greenish tint to the rain. By dawn, the entire town had transformed. Towering trees with leaves as black as night and vines that seemed to pulse with life stretched as far as the eye could see. Lisa, a botanist visiting her grandmother, was the first to step outside. "It's beautiful," she whispered, staring at the vibrant flowers blooming in unnatural patterns. But her awe turned to terror as she noticed a small bird land on a vine. The plant reacted instantly, wrapping around the bird and pulling it into its center. Moments later, nothing remained but a few feathers. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hunting. Chapter 2: The First Victims. By midday, search parties had formed to find missing residents. Entire houses were engulfed by the new forest, their rooftops barely visible through the dense canopy. Lisa joined one of the groups, determined to understand the nature of this bizarre ecosystem. They ventured deeper into the forest, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. "Stay together," warned Sheriff Daniels, his voice steady despite the growing unease. But it wasn't enough. One by one, members of the group were snatched by creeping vines or swallowed by pits lined with razor-sharp leaves. Their screams echoed briefly before fading into silence. Lisa's scientific curiosity turned to pure survival instinct. She realized this was no ordinary forest, it was a predator. Chapter 3: The Discovery. Lisa and the remaining survivors stumbled upon an ancient stone altar hidden deep within the forest. Strange carvings depicted figures summoning rain, followed by the rise of a monstrous forest consuming everything in its path. "This isn't natural," Lisa muttered, tracing her fingers over the worn symbols. "It's some kind of curse." The altar's centerpiece was a cracked basin, filled with a thick, green liquid that emitted a faint glow. "Maybe this is the source," Lisa suggested. The group debated destroying it, but hesitated, unsure of what further chaos it might unleash. As they argued, the forest seemed to grow more aggressive, vines inching closer and flowers releasing spores that caused hallucinations. Time was running out. Chapter 4: The Plan. Back in town, Lisa pored over her grandmother's old journals, searching for clues. One entry stood out: "The rainbringer must be appeased, or the forest will feed until nothing remains." The text described a ritual requiring a rare flower that grew at the forest's heart. The flower, known as the moon petal, could supposedly reverse the curse. Lisa knew the journey would be dangerous, but there was no other choice. Gathering a small team, she armed herself with what little they had: axes, torches, and sheer determination. "We either end this, or we all die," she said grimly. Chapter 5: Into the Heart. The journey to the forest center was a nightmare. Every step was a battle against the living plants. The team used their torches to keep the vines at bay, but their fuel was limited. As they ventured deeper, the forest became darker, the air heavy with an almost sentient malice. Lisa spotted the moon petal growing on a cliff surrounded by writhing vines. "There it is," she whispered. But reaching it would require someone to distract the plants while another retrieved the flower. Sheriff Daniels volunteered without hesitation. "Get the flower. Save the town," he said before charging into the vines, drawing their attention. With the sheriff's sacrifice, Lisa managed to pluck the moon petal. Its petals glowed faintly, as if pulsing with hope. Chapter 6: The Ritual. Returning to the altar, Lisa placed the moon petal in the basin, following the instructions from her grandmother's journal. The forest reacted violently, shaking the ground and releasing a deafening roar. "It's fighting back," Lisa shouted as the others tried to hold their ground. The green liquid in the basin began to boil, emitting a blinding light. The forest screamed, its vines thrashing wildly before retreating. One by one, the monstrous plants withered and crumbled, leaving behind a barren wasteland where the lush forest had stood. Chapter 7: The Aftermath. The town was saved, but at a great cost. Many lives were lost, and the land was scarred by the forest's brief but deadly existence. Lisa stood at the edge of the ruins, clutching her grandmother's journal. "It's over," she said, though her voice carried little relief. The moon petal had vanished, its purpose fulfilled. But the memory of the forest lingered in the minds of the survivors, a constant reminder of the danger that came from meddling with forces beyond their understanding. Chapter 8: The Warning. Weeks later, Lisa received an anonymous letter. Inside was a single sentence: "The Rainbringer watches." Attached was a photograph of another town, its streets overtaken by the same black-leaved trees. Lisa's heart sank. The curse wasn't gone, it had simply moved on. Determined to prevent another disaster, Lisa packed her bags and set out to find the next town before it was too late. The Rain Phantom. Chapter 1: The Silent Storm. It began with the rain, as it always did. No warning, no thunder, just a sudden, heavy downpour that blanketed the small coastal town of Greyston. The streets emptied as people hurried indoors, but Claire remained at the edge of the pier, staring into the water. She loved the rain. It was soothing, a comforting rhythm that reminded her of childhood. But tonight, something felt different. Through the mist and rain, she saw it, a figure, barely visible, moving just beneath the water's surface. "Is someone out there?" she called. The figure didn't answer. It drifted closer, rising slowly until Claire could make out its shape, a translucent, humanoid form, its features blurred like glass. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed faintly. Claire took a step back. The figure reached upward, its hand breaking the surface of the water, impossibly long fingers curling toward her. Chapter 2: Vanished without a trace. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but Claire didn't come home. Her car was still parked by the pier, her shoes left on the dock, soaked from the storm. Her boyfriend, Marcus, led the search party. They combed the shoreline and dragged the waters but found no sign of her. It was as though she had simply disappeared. She loved the water, Marcus said, staring out at the calm sea. She wouldn't just leave. But Claire wasn't the only one. Over the next week, 3 more people vanished during rainstorms. A jogger on a forest trail, a fisherman by the lake, a child playing in their backyard. No witnesses, no bodies, just silence. Chapter 3: The Phantom's Warning. Emma, a local bartender, heard the stories but didn't believe them. People vanish all the time, she said to her customers. It's tragic, but it's not some ghost story. That night, as the rain began to fall, Emma walked home alone. The streets were slick, the air heavy with the smell of wet asphalt. She didn't notice the figure at first, not until she heard the faint sound of water splashing behind her. Turning, she saw it, a translucent figure standing in the middle of the street, its body shimmering like raindrops caught in the light. "Hello," Emma called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it raised its hand and pointed at her. The rain around Emma grew heavier, pounding against her like a living force. She stumbled back, gasping for breath, and when she looked up again, the figure was gone. Chapter 4: The Forgotten Past. Emma survived, but she couldn't shake the memory of the figure. She began digging into Greyston's history, desperate for answers. Old newspaper clippings revealed a pattern, disappearances dating back decades, all during heavy rainstorms. The stories were always the same: no witnesses, no bodies, just people vanishing into thin air. One article mentioned a shipwreck from the 1800s, a trading vessel caught in a violent storm just off the coast. According to legend, the ship's crew had drowned, their bodies never recovered. Some claimed their restless spirits lingered, trapped in the rain that took their lives. Emma wasn't sure if she believed it, but the coincidence was too strong to ignore. Chapter 5: The Phantom's Curse. The rain returned with a vengeance that night, pounding harder than ever. Emma stayed inside, but she couldn't ignore the whispers she heard over the storm. It sounded like voices, muffled and distant, as though coming from underwater. She pressed her ear to the window and heard a single word clearly: help. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her coat and flashlight and stepped into the storm. The whispers grew louder, pulling her toward the pier. As she approached the water, the translucent figure appeared again. This time, there were others with it, shadowy shapes rising from the waves, their blurred faces twisted in agony. Chapter 6: Pulled Beneath. Emma tried to run, but the rain was relentless, the wind pushing her toward the edge of the dock. She slipped, landing hard on the wet wood. The translucent figure loomed over her, its hand reaching out. When it touched her, it felt like ice, burning cold and wet. Suddenly, the dock cracked, and Emma plunged into the water. She kicked and thrashed, but the phantom held her, dragging her deeper into the freezing depths. Around her, the other figures swirled, their distorted faces screaming silently. Just as her vision began to blur, she broke free and clawed her way to the surface, gasping for air. The figures had vanished, but the whispers remained. Chapter 7: The Survivor's Warning. Emma didn't sleep that night. She told Marcus everything, her voice shaking as she described the translucent figures and the whispers. "It's not random," she said. "They're choosing people, pulling them into the water." Marcus didn't want to believe her, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. Together, they devised a plan to catch the phantom in its tracks. Chapter 8: The Trap. The next storm came quickly, and Marcus and Emma were ready. Armed with floodlights and ropes, they waited by the pier, watching the water. When the figure appeared, they sprang into action. Marcus turned on the floodlights, illuminating the phantom. It writhed under the light, its form flickering as though it were made of smoke. Emma threw the rope, hoping to trap it, but the phantom moved faster than she anticipated. It lashed out, and Marcus screamed as it grabbed him, dragging him toward the water. Chapter 9: Into the Depths. Emma held on to Marcus with all her strength, refusing to let the phantom take him. The water rose around them, unnaturally high, as the other figures emerged, their translucent forms pulling at her arms. Summoning all her courage, Emma grabbed the floodlight and pointed it directly at the phantom. It shrieked, its body dissolving into mist. The other figures faded, and the water receded, leaving Emma and Marcus soaked and trembling on the dock. Chapter 10: The Phantom's Legacy. The storm eventually passed, and for the first time in weeks, the rain stopped. Emma and Marcus hoped it was over, that the phantom had been defeated. But as they walked home, Emma noticed something in the puddles. Reflections of faces, distorted, translucent faces, watching her. The rain might have stopped, but the phantom hadn't gone. It was waiting, lurking just beneath the surface, ready for the next storm. Hollow Rain. Chapter 1: The Silent Storm. It began like any other rainstorm. Dark clouds rolled in during the late afternoon, swallowing the sun in a thick, grey blanket. But there was something strange about this storm. There was no sound, no rumble of thunder, no whisper of wind. The rain fell in torrents, but no drops hit the ground. Julie stood at her window, watching the strange phenomenon with unease. She opened the window slightly, expecting to hear the familiar patter of rain, but there was only silence. The street outside was eerily still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Her phone buzzed. A message from her neighbor Tom. "Are you seeing this? No rain hitting the ground. Weird as hell." She texted back, "Yeah. What do you think it means?" "Probably nothing. Going to step outside and check it out." The moment Tom opened his front door, Julie gasped. The rain enveloped him, but he didn't get wet. Then, without a sound, he simply vanished. Chapter 2: The Missing Neighbors. Julie stood frozen, staring at the spot where Tom had been. His door hung open, rain streaming in, but no trace of him remained. She grabbed her phone and called his number. It rang once before cutting off. She texted another neighbor, Gina, asking if she had seen what happened. Gina responded, "I saw him disappear. What the hell is going on?" Julie's pulse quickened as she peered out the window again. Across the street, another neighbor stepped outside, seemingly curious about the rain. As soon as his foot hit the porch, he too disappeared, swallowed by the silent storm. Chapter 3: The News Reports. Julie flipped on the TV, searching for answers. Local news anchors reported the strange weather but seemed oblivious to the disappearances. The meteorologist described it as an anomalous atmospheric event, but no warnings were issued. Social media was a different story. Videos flooded in of people vanishing as they stepped into the rain. A trending hashtag emerged, #HolloRain. Someone had captured slow-motion footage of a person disappearing. The rain seemed to distort their body, stretching them like vapor before they faded entirely. Theories ranged from government experiments to alien abductions, but no one had answers. Chapter 4: The Daring Escape. Julie's phone buzzed again. It was Gina. "I'm leaving. Can't stay here. This feels wrong." Julie begged her not to go. "No one comes back, Gina. Just stay inside." But moments later, Gina's front door creaked open. Julie watched helplessly as Gina stepped onto her porch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Gina tilted her head back, as if hearing something. She stretched out her arms, took a step into the rain, and vanished. Julie slumped against the wall, tears streaming down her face. Chapter 5: The Unseen Presence. That night, Julie couldn't sleep. The soundless rain continued, endless and oppressive. Every so often, she thought she saw faint shapes moving in the downpour, shadows that weren't quite human. At 3 a.m., her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, "Stay inside. It's not rain." Her heart pounded. She replied, "Who is this?" No response. Chapter 6: The Rain's Whisper. The next morning, the rain continued, unrelenting. Julie noticed something new, a faint whispering sound coming from outside. It wasn't voices, exactly, but it felt intentional, like the storm was calling out to her. Her curiosity warred with her fear. She grabbed a broom handle and slowly extended it out the door, into the rain. The moment the handle crossed the threshold, it dissolved, leaving only the faint smell of burning wood. Chapter 7: The Survivors Network. Desperate for answers, Julie turned to the internet. A small group on a forum claimed to have experienced similar storms. They called it the hollow rain phenomenon and shared their theories. One post caught her attention. The rain is alive. It's searching for something. Don't listen to the whispers. Another user had a darker theory. The ones who disappear aren't gone. They're taken somewhere else. And they don't come back. Chapter 8. The broadcast. That evening, the power flickered, and Julie's TV switched to static. Then a newscaster appeared on the screen, wide-eyed and trembling. "If you're seeing this, do not go outside," she said. "This is not a natural event. The rain is a gateway. It takes you somewhere, but we don't know where." Before she could say more, the screen went black. Chapter 9. The Law. The whispers grew louder as night fell, forming words. "Come outside. It's safe now." Julie clenched her fists, refusing to give in. She stared out the window, her breath fogging the glass. The shadows in the rain seemed more defined now, almost humanoid. They moved closer to her house, their forms stretching unnaturally. One of them stopped at her window and pressed a hand, if it could be called that, against the glass. Julie backed away, her chest tight with fear. Chapter 10. The Choice. By morning, the rain finally stopped. The streets were eerily quiet, devoid of life. Cars sat abandoned, doors hanging open. Julie hesitated before stepping outside. The world felt wrong. Her phone buzzed again, another message from the unknown number. "You're safe. For now. But it will come back." Julie looked up at the sky. The clouds were already forming again, darker and heavier than before. This time, she wasn't sure if she could resist. Shadows in the rain. Chapter 1. The First Shadow. It was a quiet evening when the rain began. The kind of drizzle that soaked the air but left the streets glistening under the dim orange glow of streetlights. Nora was returning home after a long shift at the diner, her boots splashing softly in shallow puddles. At first, she didn't notice anything unusual. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow dart across the wet pavement. She looked up, expecting someone nearby, but the street was empty. "Just my imagination," she muttered, shaking her head. But as she turned the corner, she noticed another shadow, long and thin, moving across the sidewalk, detached from any source. Nora froze. The shadow stopped too, stretching unnaturally, as though it had noticed her. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Rain. The next day, the rain hadn't stopped. It fell harder now, drumming against windows and roofs, muting the sounds of the world. Nora couldn't shake the unease from the previous night. As she sat in her living room, sipping tea, she glanced out the window and saw them again, shadows moving on the street below. She leaned closer, squinting. The shadows had no origin, no people, no objects. They slithered along the ground like ink spilled in water, their movements deliberate. Then she heard it. A faint whisper, like rain trickling down a drain. She turned toward the sound and found herself staring at her own shadow. It was still, but something about it felt wrong, as though it were watching her. Chapter 3. The Stalking Begins. Nora tried to brush off the feeling, but everywhere she went, the shadows followed. They moved when no one else did, stretched unnaturally along walls and streets. On her way home from the grocery store, she saw one slip beneath a parked car, lingering as if waiting for her. Another slithered up the side of a building, its edges jagged and twitching. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They didn't sound like words, but they carried intent. Malice. She rushed home, slamming the door behind her. As she locked it, she noticed her shadow on the floor. It flickered, as though it had moved independently. Chapter 4. The Disappearances. By the third day, the town was in a panic. People were disappearing. Friends, neighbors, co-workers, one by one, they were vanishing without a trace. Nora overheard two customers at the diner talking in hushed voices. "They say the shadows took him," one said. "The rain started, and he just wasn't there anymore," the other replied. Nora's stomach churned. Could the shadows actually be taking people? When she got home that night, she locked all the doors and windows. But as she climbed into bed, she noticed her shadow again, stretching unnaturally long against the wall. It wasn't hers anymore. Chapter 5. The Man in the Rain. Nora began seeing the same figure every night, a tall, thin man standing in the rain outside her apartment. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat, but his face was obscured, as though the rain itself blurred his features. He never moved. He just stood there, watching. The shadows around him seemed alive, writhing at his feet like snakes. Nora stayed awake all night, clutching a kitchen knife, but the figure didn't leave. When dawn finally broke, he was gone, but the rain continued to fall. Chapter 6. The First Encounter. Determined to get answers, Nora decided to confront the man. She armed herself with a flashlight and a baseball bat before stepping into the rain. As she approached, the air grew colder. The shadows around the man twitched, sliding toward her. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The man tilted his head, and for the first time, he moved. His hand extended, long and skeletal, pointing to her shadow on the ground. Before she could react, her shadow stretched upward, detaching itself from her feet. It twisted into a humanoid form, eyeless but grinning. Nora screamed and ran. Chapter 7. The Shadow's Pursuit. Back in her apartment, Nora barricaded herself inside. But the shadow had followed her. It slithered under the door, pooling on the floor before reforming into its monstrous shape. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, its limbs stretching too far as it crawled toward her. She shone the flashlight on it, and the shadow recoiled, screeching. It dissolved into a puddle and slipped away, but not before leaving behind a single, chilling whisper, "You can't run forever." Chapter 8. A Town Devoured. By the end of the week, the town was almost deserted. The rain never stopped, and the shadows had claimed nearly everyone. Nora watched from her window as the few remaining people were dragged into the darkness, their screams swallowed by the rain. The man in the rain stood at the center of it all, motionless, as though orchestrating the chaos. Nora knew her time was running out. Chapter 9. The Final Stand. Desperate, Nora devised a plan. She gathered mirrors, flashlights, and anything reflective, setting them up around her apartment. She hoped to trap the shadow if it came for her again. That night, the rain seemed louder, more insistent. The man appeared outside her window, closer than ever. The shadows poured in, slithering through cracks and under doors. They surrounded her, their forms twisting and writhing. Nora turned on every light, the beams reflecting off the mirrors and scattering across the room. The shadows screamed, their forms unraveling under the assault. But the man remained, untouched. Chapter 10. The Endless Rain. As dawn broke, the shadows retreated, leaving Nora alive but shaken. She stepped outside, the rain still falling. The man in the rain was gone. But the town was a husk of its former self. Empty homes, abandoned cars, and the faint echo of whispers were all that remained. Nora looked down and froze. Her shadow was gone. Instead, it was waiting for her, standing in the rain, grinning. She turned to run, but the shadow moved faster, wrapping itself around her. The rain fell harder, drowning out her screams. By the next day, Nora's apartment was empty, her reflection the only thing left behind in a shattered mirror. And the rain continued to fall. Rain of feathers. Feathers fall instead of rain, but each feather cuts like a blade and carries a dark, ancient curse. Chapter 1. The First Drop. It began on an overcast evening in the quiet town of Ashwick. The air felt heavy, the way it does before a storm. Residents paused their evening routines, stepping out to glance at the sky. Dark clouds churned overhead, and the wind carried a strange sound, a faint rustling, like the flapping of countless wings. At first, it seemed harmless. A single white feather floated down, landing softly on the damp pavement. Then another, and another. But as the feathers accumulated, their descent grew faster, heavier, sharper. By the time the first scream rang out, the townsfolk realized they were under attack. James Carter, the town's night watchman, was patrolling near the old cathedral when a feather grazed his arm, leaving a thin, stinging cut. He stared in disbelief as blood seeped through his uniform. The feather, delicate and pristine moments ago, was now stained crimson. He didn't have time to think before a second feather embedded itself in the wooden bench beside him, slicing cleanly through the aged timber. Chapter 2. The curse unfolds. By morning, the town was unrecognizable. Feathers blanketed the streets, their edges glinting menacingly in the pale light. Windows were shattered, roofs punctured, and the once bustling marketplace lay eerily silent. A few brave souls ventured out, armed with umbrellas and tarps, only to retreat moments later as fresh waves of feathers descended, slicing through their makeshift shields. James convened an emergency meeting in the church basement, one of the few places still intact. Among the attendees was Clara Hayes, the town librarian and local historian. Clara's face was pale, her hands clutching a tattered leather book. "This has happened before," she said, her voice trembling. "It's in the old records, a curse called the Rain of Feathers. It's said to punish those who disturb the resting places of the Forgotten Ones." The Forgotten Ones were a recurring legend in Ashwick, whispered about but never taken seriously. According to the tales, they were ancient beings, neither human nor divine, buried beneath the town long before its founding. Clara explained that the curse could only be lifted by returning what had been stolen from them. Chapter 3. The Stolen Artifact. "Stolen?" James echoed, glancing around the room. "What are we talking about? Jewelry? Bones?" Clara nodded gravely. "An artifact. A black feather, said to be imbued with their power. It was housed in the cathedral's reliquary for centuries, a supposed relic of divine origin. But it's gone now." The crowd murmured uneasily. Many had seen the feather, displayed in a glass case near the altar, but few had thought much of it. James's stomach sank as he recalled the recent theft at the cathedral, dismissed at the time as a petty act of vandalism. The pieces were falling into place, and none of it boded well. "We need to find it," Clara urged. "If we don't, the curse will only get worse." Chapter 4. A Trail of Blood. James led a small group of volunteers to investigate. They started at the cathedral, searching for any clues the thief might have left behind. Clara joined them, her knowledge of the legend proving invaluable. Among the shattered glass and overturned pews, they found a trail of feathers leading into the nearby woods. The forest, usually serene, was now cloaked in an unnatural silence. The group followed the trail cautiously, their flashlights casting long shadows among the trees. The feathers grew thicker as they advanced, some still sharp enough to slice through bark. Eventually, they came upon a clearing where the ground was littered with broken branches and bloodstains. In the center stood a makeshift altar. On it rested the black feather, pulsing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly light. Surrounding it were strange symbols etched into the ground, their meaning lost to time. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Ones. Before they could retrieve the feather, the ground trembled violently. From the shadows emerged figures unlike anything they had ever seen. They were humanoid but grotesquely elongated, with feathered wings that seemed more like jagged blades. Their eyes glowed with a cold, piercing light, and their voices, a cacophony of whispers, filled the clearing. "You have disturbed our rest," the largest figure intoned, its voice reverberating in James's skull. "The feather is ours." Clara stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "We meant no harm. The theft was not our doing, but we seek to make it right. Please, end the curse." The figures regarded her silently for a moment. Then the leader spoke. "Return the feather to its rightful place. Only then will we sleep once more." Chapter 6. A Perilous Journey. Retrieving the feather was easier said than done. As James approached the altar, the otherworldly beings watched his every move, their presence suffocating. He lifted the feather carefully, its dark energy coursing through his hands. The symbols on the ground flared to life, and the whispers grew louder, threatening to overwhelm him. "Hurry!" Clara shouted, guiding him back toward the group. The journey back to the cathedral was fraught with danger. The rain of feathers intensified, forcing them to take shelter under thick blankets and makeshift shields. The beings followed at a distance, their eyes glowing in the dark like distant lanterns. Chapter 7. Restoring Balance. When they finally reached the cathedral, the group hurried to the reliquary. The building groaned under the weight of the storm, but they pressed on. James placed the black feather back in its glass case, and Clara recited a prayer she had found in the ancient texts. As the last word left her lips, a deafening silence fell. The feathers ceased their descent, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. Outside, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, bathing the town in golden light. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The town of Ashwick bore the scars of the cursed rain. Buildings were damaged, and many residents carried wounds, both physical and emotional. But the curse was broken, and life slowly returned to normal. James and Clara became local heroes, though they sought no recognition. The black feather remained locked away in the reliquary, guarded more closely than ever. The town council voted to increase security around the cathedral, ensuring the artifact would never be disturbed again. Chapter 9. Warnings in the Wind. Despite the resolution, James couldn't shake the feeling that the Forgotten Ones were still watching. On quiet nights, when the wind rustled through the trees, he swore he could hear faint whispers, a reminder of the thin veil between their world and his own. Clara, too, felt the lingering presence. She dedicated her life to studying the town's history, determined to uncover the full truth about the Forgotten Ones. Her research uncovered more cryptic warnings, hinting that the Rain of Feathers was but one of many curses tied to the ancient beings. Chapter 10. A New Storm. Years later, a new priest at the cathedral grew curious about the black feather. Ignoring the warnings etched into the reliquary, he removed it to examine its craftsmanship. That night, the wind picked up, carrying with it a familiar sound, the rustling of countless wings. The Storm Shepherd. A cloaked figure appears in storms, herding monstrous creatures through the town. Chapter 1. The Ominous Clouds. The storm came without warning, rolling in like an invading army. Dark clouds smothered the evening sky, plunging the town of Black Hollow into premature darkness. Abigail Price, a schoolteacher and avid weather enthusiast, was the first to notice something unusual. The storm clouds didn't move naturally, they spiraled, coiling like a serpent, centered directly over the town. As rain began to fall, Abigail stood at her window, mesmerized. It wasn't just rain. Thin streaks of lightning illuminated shapes in the downpour, fleeting and distorted. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but then she saw it, a cloaked figure striding through the storm, surrounded by creatures that defied explanation. Hulking forms with elongated limbs and glowing eyes prowled through the sheets of rain, their movements both predatory and deliberate. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Storm. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a town shaken and confused. Trees were uprooted, power lines snapped, and streets flooded. Yet, there was an eerie absence of animal life. No birds chirped, no stray cats darted through alleys. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed to have seen monstrous beasts roaming the streets, while others swore they heard voices carried on the wind. Abigail couldn't shake what she'd seen. She visited the local diner, hoping to find answers among the usual gossip. To her surprise, nearly everyone was talking about the storm. Old Mr. Hargrove, a self-proclaimed historian, leaned forward in his booth and whispered, "That was no ordinary storm. It's the Storm Shepherd." "The what?" Abigail asked, incredulous. "A legend," he said, his voice grave. "The shepherd comes to guide the forgotten, the lost. But what it guides is not meant for this world." Chapter 3. Signs in the Shadows. Determined to uncover the truth, Abigail visited the town's small library. Its collection was modest, but tucked away in a dusty corner, she found a journal belonging to a former resident. The entries were dated nearly a century ago and described storms that mirrored what Black Hollow had just experienced. One passage stood out: "The shepherd's cloak is woven from the tempest itself. Where it walks, the creatures follow, born of lightning and shadow. They are not alive, but neither are they dead." As Abigail read, the lights flickered. A low rumble of thunder echoed outside, though the sky was clear. She felt a chill and glanced at the window. For a split second, she thought she saw the outline of the cloaked figure standing across the street, watching. Chapter 4. The First Vanishing. That night, the storm returned. Abigail watched from her attic, her heart pounding as the rain lashed against the roof. This time, the creatures were clearer. They moved through the streets with purpose, their glowing eyes scanning the houses. The cloaked figure raised an arm, pointing toward a small home near the edge of town. A scream pierced the air. The creatures converged on the house, their forms blending with the storm, When the lightning flashed again, the house was empty. The family who lived there was gone, as if they'd never existed. Abigail realized the storm wasn't random. It was choosing, targeting, and it was far from over. Chapter 5: Gathering the Pieces. The next morning, Abigail sought out Mr. Hargrove. She found him in his cluttered workshop, poring over old maps and weather charts. "It's the shepherd," he confirmed when she described what she'd seen. "It's hunting." "Hunting what?" Abigail asked. "Not what. Who?" He hesitated, then pointed to a map of Black Hollow. "This town was built on cursed ground. The shepherd's storms come to claim those tied to the curse, descendants of those who disturbed the balance." Abigail felt a sinking dread. "And how do we stop it?" Hargrove shook his head. "You don't stop the shepherd. You survive it." Chapter 6: The Mark of the Storm. Abigail began noticing patterns. The targeted families had strange marks on their homes, faint etchings that looked like symbols scorched into the wood. She checked her own house and felt a wave of relief when she found nothing. But the relief was short-lived. That evening, as the storm clouds gathered again, she found the mark on her car. It hadn't been there that morning. The storm hit harder than ever. Abigail barricaded herself inside, her heart racing with every crack of thunder. She could hear the creatures outside, their claws scraping against the walls. And then came the voice, deep and resonant, carried by the wind: "You are chosen." Chapter 7: Confronting the Shepherd. When the storm finally abated, Abigail decided she couldn't run. She had to face the shepherd. With Hargrove's reluctant help, she pieced together a plan. According to the journal, the shepherd's power was tied to an artifact hidden in the town's old church, a weathered staff said to control storms. The church was nearly in ruins, but Abigail found the staff buried beneath the altar. The moment she touched it, the air grew heavy, and the storm clouds began to swirl anew. She stepped outside, the staff in hand, and waited. The shepherd appeared, its cloaked form emerging from the tempest. The creatures followed, their eyes fixed on her. Abigail planted the staff in the ground and shouted, "This ends now." Chapter 8: The Final Tempest. The shepherd raised its arm, and the creatures lunged. Lightning struck the staff, sending a shockwave through the air. Abigail held her ground, the energy coursing through her like fire. The creatures recoiled, their forms dissipating into mist. The shepherd hesitated, its glowing eyes meeting hers. For a moment, it seemed almost human. Then, with a deafening roar, it dissolved into the storm, taking the clouds with it. The rain stopped, and the night was eerily quiet. Chapter 9: The Aftermath. Black Hollow slowly began to heal. The missing families were never found, and the town mourned their loss. Abigail became a reluctant hero, though she refused to talk about what had happened that night. The staff was returned to the church, hidden away once more. Hargrove warned her that the shepherd might return. "Curses like this don't just disappear," he said. But Abigail chose to believe that she had bought the town time to prepare, to understand. Chapter 10: The Whispering Wind. Years later, on a quiet summer night, Abigail sat on her porch, enjoying the peace she had fought so hard to reclaim. But as the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of distant thunder, she felt a familiar chill. She looked to the horizon and saw the clouds beginning to spiral. The Weeping Window. Chapter 1: The First Tears. The rain began as a whisper against the glass, soft and steady. The Matthews family had only moved into the old house a week ago, but already, something about it felt wrong. The walls creaked in protest at night, and the air always seemed thick with the scent of damp wood, even on dry days. That night, as the storm rolled in, Sarah Matthews sat in the living room, sipping her tea while her husband, Mark, flipped through channels. Their twin daughters, Emily and Sophie, were upstairs in bed. Then, she heard it. A faint, wet sound, like fingers dragging down a fogged mirror. She turned toward the window. It was crying. Not rain trickling down the glass, but something else, thicker, almost syrupy, forming streaks that ran in slow, deliberate lines. She stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass. That's when she saw the shape of a face, pressed against the inside of the window. And it was screaming. Chapter 2: something in the glass. Sarah staggered back, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Mark," she whispered, but when she turned to him, the face was gone. "What is it?" Mark asked, looking up. Sarah hesitated. I thought I saw something." Mark chuckled. "It's just the rain playing tricks on you." But when she turned back, she could still see the faint outline of the streaks. Like someone had dragged their fingers down the inside of the window. Upstairs, the girls giggled in their room, unaware of the silent figure watching from the glass. Chapter 3: The Forgotten House. The next morning, Sarah couldn't shake the unease. She decided to ask the real estate agent, Mrs. Duval, about the house's history. Mrs. Duval's smile faltered when Sarah brought it up. "Oh, it's an old home, dear. Old homes have character. But has anything strange ever happened here?" The woman hesitated before sighing. "Many years ago, a man named Robert Grayson lived here with his wife and son. There was a terrible storm one night. The wife and child vanished without a trace. Robert swore the house took them. He became obsessed, said he could hear them crying through the windows. What happened to him? He boarded up every window in the house," Mrs. Duval said quietly. "Then he hanged himself in the attic." Chapter 4: The Voices in the Storm. That night, another storm rolled in. The moment the rain hit, Sarah heard it again, the wet, sorrowful sound of the windows weeping. Emily and Sophie screamed. Sarah and Mark ran upstairs, finding the twins huddled together in bed, their windows streaked with thick, glistening trails. "There was someone in the glass," Emily sobbed. "It was looking at us," Sophie cried. Mark opened the window, letting the rain spray in. "See? Nothing's there." But Sarah knew. Something was there, and it was getting closer. Chapter 5: The Reflection That Wasn't Hers. The next day, Sarah covered the windows with thick curtains, hoping to block whatever was trying to get through. That night, when she went to brush her teeth, she saw it again. In the bathroom mirror, behind her reflection, something else. A woman, her face streaked with tears, her mouth open in a silent wail. Sarah spun around. Nothing was there, but when she looked back, the woman was closer. And this time, Sarah heard her. "Help us." Chapter 6: The Trapped Souls. Sarah couldn't ignore it anymore. She dug into the house's history and found an old newspaper article. Robert Grayson's wife and child had never truly disappeared. Their bodies were found inside the house, inside the walls, buried alive. The windows weren't crying because of the rain. They were crying because the spirits of the trapped family were still inside. And they wanted out. Chapter 7: The Cracking Glass. The next storm arrived with a vengeance. The windows wept harder than ever, the thick streaks running like blood. Then the whispers began. "Let us out." Mark still didn't believe her. "It's just the house settling," he insisted. But then Emily and Sophie screamed again. This time, their window was cracking. Hands, pale, wet hands, were pressing against the glass from the inside. And they were pushing through. Chapter 8: The House Awakens. The power cut out. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flashes of lightning outside. Sarah grabbed the girls, racing down the stairs, but the walls groaned as if the house itself was moving. The windows in the living room shattered. Figures began to emerge, translucent, twisted with sorrow, their mouths open in silent screams. Robert Grayson's wife, his child, and dozens of others. All the souls trapped inside the glass, all reaching for them. Chapter 9: The Escape. Mark finally saw them. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Sarah grabbed his hand. "We have to go, now." They ran for the front door, but the house fought them. The walls pulsed, and a deep, groaning sound echoed through the halls. The spirits weren't just escaping. The house itself was alive. As the last window shattered, releasing a final wail, the Matthews family burst outside into the storm. Behind them, the house began to collapse in on itself, like a thing that had finally taken its last breath. And then, there was silence. Chapter 10: The Last Window. Days later, the Matthews family stayed in a motel, trying to recover. The news called it an unexplained structural collapse. But Sarah knew better. One evening, as she was tucking the girls into bed, she glanced at the motel window. There, in the reflection, she saw a streak of water running down the glass. A single, slow tear. And behind it, in the dim light, the faint outline of a woman's face. Watching. Waiting. The windows were still weeping. And somewhere, the spirits were searching for a new home. The Cradle in the Rain. Chapter 1. The First Cry. It was a cold, wet night when the crying began. Clara was curled up on her couch, listening to the rain tap against the windows, when the faint sound of a baby's wail pierced the quiet. At first, she thought it was the TV, but when she muted the show, the cries persisted, soft, mournful, and coming from outside. She frowned, pulling her robe tighter as she peered out the window. The street was empty, save for the rain pooling in the cracks of the pavement. Yet the cries grew louder, tugging at her instincts. "There's no way a baby's out there in this weather," she whispered to herself. But as the sound continued, she couldn't ignore it. Grabbing her flashlight, she stepped into the storm. Chapter 2. Vanishing Tracks. The rain was heavier than Clara expected, soaking her in seconds as she stepped onto the porch. The cries were clearer now, coming from the park at the end of the street. "Hello? Is someone out here?" she called, but no one answered. She followed the sound, her flashlight beam cutting through the dark. When she reached the park, she saw something small, a wicker cradle, sitting in the middle of the playground. It rocked gently in the wind, though there was no breeze. Clara approached cautiously. The cries were louder now, echoing around her. But as she drew closer, she noticed something chilling. The cradle was empty. Then the cries stopped, leaving only the sound of rain. Chapter 3. The Missing Neighbor. The next morning, Clara couldn't shake the memory of the empty cradle. She mentioned it to her neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, an older woman known for her nosiness. "Did you hear anything last night?" Clara asked. Mrs. Calloway frowned. "You mean the baby? Poor thing, crying its heart out. I went to check, but I didn't find anything." That evening, Mrs. Calloway's house was silent. Her porch light flickered in the rain, and her curtains were drawn. When Clara knocked, there was no answer. By morning, Mrs. Calloway was gone. The police found no signs of forced entry, no struggle, just an empty house. Chapter 4. The Town's Curse. Word spread quickly about Mrs. Calloway's disappearance. Clara started asking questions, talking to others in the neighborhood. That's when she learned about the legend. Years ago, during a storm much like this one, a young mother had vanished while searching for her missing baby. Locals claimed her spirit lingered, eternally searching, luring others to their doom with the sound of her child's cries. "They call it the Cradle in the Rain," one neighbor whispered. "You hear it. You don't follow it. That's how they get you." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard the cries, and she had followed them. Chapter 5. The Return of the Cradle. Another storm rolled in, heavier than the last. Clara stayed inside, double-checking her locks and keeping her lights on. But then the crying began again. It was louder this time, more urgent. Clara clenched her fists, trying to block it out, but the sound seeped into her mind, tugging at her heart. She looked out the window. There it was, the cradle, sitting in the middle of the street, rocking gently in the rain. Clara's pulse quickened. She knew she shouldn't go, but something compelled her. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her flashlight and umbrella and stepped outside. Chapter 6. The Shadows in the Storm. As Clara approached the cradle, the rain seemed to intensify, drumming against her skin. The cries were deafening now, echoing in her ears. She reached out to touch the cradle, but as her fingers brushed the wicker, the cries stopped abruptly. The air grew still. Then, from the corner of her eye, Clara saw them, shadows, moving in the rain. They were tall, indistinct figures, watching her from the edges of the streetlights. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The shadows didn't answer. They began to move closer, their forms shifting and twisting like smoke. Chapter 7. The Haunting Truth. Clara ran, leaving the cradle behind. When she reached her house, she locked the door and turned on every light. But the cries followed her, growing louder and more insistent. Desperate for answers, she dug into the town's archives. She found an old photograph of the mother who had vanished, the same stormy night she had lost her baby. Beneath the photo was a chilling note: "They are together now, forever bound to the rain." Clara realized the truth. The spirit wasn't just searching for her baby, it was collecting others to join her. Chapter 8: The Baby's Lure. The next night, Clara heard the cries again. This time, they were coming from her own backyard. She hesitated, staring at the back door. "This isn't real," she whispered, but the sound was relentless, tugging at her heart. When she opened the door, the cradle was there, rocking in the rain. But this time, there was something inside it, a bundle wrapped in a wet, tattered blanket. Clara's breath caught. The cries stopped, and the bundle began to move. Slowly, she reached for it. Chapter 9: The Spirit's Grasp. As Clara lifted the blanket, she froze. There was no baby, only a puddle of water. Before she could react, the shadows returned, pouring into her yard like liquid darkness. They surrounded her, their cold, wet hands pulling at her arms. The rain fell harder, and Clara felt herself being dragged toward the cradle. She screamed, but no one came to help. In the distance, she saw the spirit of the mother, her translucent figure glowing faintly in the storm. The woman smiled, a cold, hollow expression, as Clara was pulled into the cradle. Chapter 10: Forever in the Rain. When the storm passed, Clara's house was silent. Her neighbors found her back door open, rain pooling on the floor. The cradle was gone. So was Clara. But on the next rainy night, the cries began again. This time, the sound was different. Softer. Like two voices crying in harmony. Those who heard it knew better than to follow. But for the unlucky few who couldn't resist, the cradle waited, rocking gently in the rain.